You are listening to Get Your News On with Ron, the world's first viewer-curated streaming news show. It is Music Monday, and sometimes on Music Monday, we get a guest. And today is one of those days. I'm so excited to have this guy. Our guest today is Franz Nicolay. He is an author. His book, The Humorless Ladies of Border Patrol, I loved it, and that's what we're going to talk about a lot today. He is also a singer-songwriter, and he is the keyboardist for the Hold Steady. Franz, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, man, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about the book. I emailed you and I read your book, and I was expecting a fun punk rock travel book, which it was that. But then it was so much more, though. I mean, you talk about like just different cultures. You talk about the history of so many places. You talk about the political turmoil that did and didn't exist in a lot of the places you went to. And you went to the Ukraine, you went to Russia, and please help me out because it's been about 6 weeks. What are some of the other countries that are featured in that book?
Yeah, a lot of the post-communist world. So the Balkans, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Poland, Hungary, Eastern Europe, Mongolia. I was in China playing some shows, although that chapter didn't make it into the book. Yeah. Every time I would go, I had been touring in Europe with bands and by myself for years at that point. But when I was traveling alone, I realized that I had this freedom to go to places that wouldn't make sense to bring a whole group of people, a whole band infrastructure. And so every time I went, I would do my 2 weeks in Germany to make some money and then use that to subsidize going a little farther and farther afield.
Mm-hmm. So what made you decide that this was the book project? Like, how did this book come to fruition that this is the book and now's the time? I know a lot of the touring took place in 2012, correct?
Yeah, 2012 through 2014. So
okay.
The last chapter is when I was in Ukraine in 2014 in the wake of the Maidan revolution there. Yeah, I had been writing. So I was a touring musician in more or less full time for years and years, and there's a lot of downtime when you're a touring musician. People fill it up in all kinds of ways, some healthy and some not. Once the novelty as a younger touring musician of getting wasted every night wears off, you need to find other things to keep yourself occupied. And one of the things that I discovered is that the touring lifestyle sort of synchronizes pretty well with good writing practice. So I started doing a lot of writing. You have a lot of downtime to watch the country go by, to meet people, to make notes of the weird vernacular way that people speak, or funny stories that you hear, or interesting characters that you meet. And so I was writing longer and longer pieces, and it seemed like the time was right to do a book-length project. I had this trip planned across Russia, a 1-month tour across Russia on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and that had sort of started to expand on either side. And I just figured that would be a good jumping-off place to potentially write a book project. So I was just taking notes along the way of that, and once it seemed clear that I did have enough to build a book around, I went back to some of the places, et cetera, et cetera.
So you did a lot of writing on the road, and I actually wanted to ask you that. I mean, your description of the touring lifestyle, I'm totally on board. I'm a touring comedian myself, so it's a very similar thing, except we always travel alone. That's the big difference. But there are so many intense days, especially some of the stuff you described in the book. I mean, you got caught in a snowstorm for over 7 hours. You were in standstill that entire time. You were going via rail at times, via rental car at other times. It looked like some extensive travel. So what was kind of like the real nitty gritty mechanics of like the day-to-day life? When did you finally get that time to kind of just put pen to paper?
Yeah, so a good chunk of that was I was traveling alone. There was about 6 months where I was with my wife, but otherwise, I was a pack mule with a couple instruments and a bag full of merch, which is fine. The overhead is so low that then you can come home with money in your pocket, as even if you don't if you're only making 100 or 200 bucks a night.
Mm-hmm.
If you only spend 50 bucks a day, then, you know, that's a pretty good, the margins are pretty good. But yeah, then you don't have any backup when things are tough, or, you know, when you're stranded in a car on a highway in a snowstorm overnight. Yeah, that sort of thing. When did I write? I mean, I would, you know, the logistics of the day tended to be driving during the day. You arrive at the club, you introduce yourself, you meet everyone, you sound check, and then you have a couple hours off. So a lot of it was then.
Mm-hmm.
I would, when I was driving, I would have a piece, you know, a spiral notebook in the passenger seat and a pen, so that if I, you know, if I was watching things go by and I had a turn of phrase that I wanted to remember, I could sort of scribble that without taking my eyes off the road. There was some of that I would then transcribe into my phone. I would have conversations with some people sometimes, and if I wanted to remember what they said, I would excuse myself to the bathroom and type it into my phone.
Nice.
In Ukraine and Russia and in Mongolia, I was traveling by train. So that sort of reverses the day-to-day of it. It's a little bit more like being in a tour bus, actually, because you'd spend the night on the bunk on the train, wake up, get picked up by the promoter in the morning, have all day to sort of bum around the town and see the sights and meet people, play the show, and then get delivered to the train station at 1 or 2 a.m. after the show. So and particularly some of the more far-flung, once I got farther east in Siberia, there were situations where it would be, sleep on the train, spend the whole day on the trains, and then sleep again on the train. And those are great times to sort of consolidate notes because there's no internet access. You're spending all day on the train. You're just watching, mile after mile of forest and little villages go by. So that was good for writing some of the more lyrical passages, describing what that looks like, describing what that feels like, take a nap, drink a beer, type up my notes from the previous days, something like that, catch as catch can.
So, like, getting into the mechanics of the book, one thing I really appreciated about it was, you did bring, I mean, I learned a lot. Like, I learned a lot about just history from reading your book. And, but you also kind of seamlessly transitioned back into, you would be talking about some type of turmoil that maybe happened a couple decades ago and how it pertains to the experience you were having in that present moment. And then we'd be back to, and I'm really bummed out because the only thing I have to eat in this country is macaroni and sour cream, and the promoter's trying to stiff me. And it was really like just a fun weaving. Did a lot of that happen in the editing process, or did it just kind of flow that way for you naturally when you were writing?
No, that was how my day was, because I have, I've always been a really intense reader, and particularly in the sort of Slavic world, I've read a lot of history and literature around that over the years. And so I have this even before I started traveling to some of these places, I had this overlay of of what I'd read about it and of the history and of, my expectations. And so, anytime you drive into a place, there's this erasing of the imagined place and replacing it with the actual place, but you end up with these sort of palimpsest layers of what you remember from fiction, what you remember from history, what you read in the newspaper about current events, and all of that is layered on the ways different writers who have been to these places before have described them. So, how does Rebecca West describe this place? How does Eva Hoffman describe this place? How does Chekhov describe this place? These are the kind of people that you want to be in dialogue if you're describing a place, and Paul Thoreau, people. These are places that have been described by very, very great writers, and pretend that hasn't happened is sort of hubristic, I think. And of course, history and description, it doesn't happen in the abstract. It happens, if it happens to the real people in these towns and to the writers who are writing about them, right? Like, you're not getting, Chekhov's description of traveling across Siberia. In the abstract, you're getting this actual person, this doctor, traveling across Siberia and having an uncomfortable time and writing about it. Mm-hmm. So there's no disconnect in that sense between their method and mine. I thought, like I was acknowledging the history, acknowledging the writers who had been there before me, while also having my present day experience.
Well, it's funny you bring that up because I actually, one of the things I did when I was reading it was I took notes on other books I really wanted to read. Because you referenced a lot of stuff. And one thing in particular, the Rebecca West book, because I had not heard of her. I was not familiar. And I decided I wanted to pick up that book. So I went to, it's kind of a funny story. I just got back from a run myself in Florida. And I wanted to grab something from the library, get a new book to beat around when I'm traveling. And that was,
Little light reading, 1,000-page book.
Right. No, that's the thing. I went to go get it, and I had the call number, and I'm looking around, and I'm like, I don't think it's here. Someone must have taken it out. And then I was like, oh, wait, this big fucking Bible, that's the book.
Yeah.
And I was like, I am not taking this on the road with me. I'll have to do this another time. So I just did some quick shelf sleuthing, and I saw this Mark Twain thing, and I was like, that's a little easier for the road. Uh-oh, did we just lose Franz? But welcome back. We missed you.
We're talking about the Rebecca West book. I mean, that's the other thing about, the travel book genre. If you read, that book or any of the Paul Theroux books about the Trans-Siberian or anything like that, there's a lot of their personal experience on a day-to-day basis, interspersed with the long historical passages.
What's the biggest culture shock you've had? And it can pertain to the book or just pertain to whatever, but what's kind of the biggest culture shock you've had on the road?
I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I mean, there's a way in which the kind of thing that I was doing on a day-to-day is international, right? So playing DIY punk shows, that's a circuit that exists independent of where you are in the world. It's one of these sort of imaginary nation states of people who live by a certain, share an ethical code and share a sensibility and so on, whether you're in Russia or whether you're in Gainesville. I
was just in Gainesville last week.
Yeah. So there's an aspect of when you arrive at the show, you do have a common lingua franca of that. With everyone, it's just a matter of getting there, and getting there is often just a matter of language.
Mm-hmm. So I want to bring up something that you said in the book that really struck me a lot. When you left the Hold Steady, I was really bummed out, and I think I can speak for pretty much every fan. I mean, your keyboards and your vocal harmonies and the dynamic vocally between you and Craig was very missed for that period of time. And, you mentioned it briefly in the book, and the analogy you gave, I really loved. I'm going to paraphrase the analogy, but you basically said, when you hop a train, and it might be a great train, but nonetheless, when you hop a train, if it's not going to the destination, you need to get to, eventually you got to hop off. And that's scary because there's a good chance you're going to fall. There's a good chance you're going to bruise your arm. There's a good chance you're going to tumble a little bit and you might go backwards a little bit, but staying on the train's not quite an option. That's a beautiful analogy that one can just kind of carry in their lives. Could you embellish on that a little bit?
No, I think that's it.
Fair enough.
Yeah. I appreciate the kind words.
Well,
and, now I'm playing with them again.
Right. I was going to ask. So what is, just to totally clarify the current status? Are you like back, or are you just like touring back, or what's kind of the situation there? Because I know like when people saw you in the pictures for some upcoming live shows, a lot of people were really happy.
I'm in the band.
Great.
Band. Yeah.
Well, that's great, man. I mean, I for one am very, very thrilled you're back.
Yeah.
And the last time I saw you guys, it was 2006. And it was right when Boys and Girls came out. So it was a phenomenal show. And I remember you had a bottle of wine next to you on stage that just became less and less as the show went on, man. It was phenomenal.
That's still how it goes.
That's still your thing?
Yeah.
So what kind of like going backwards a little bit, you know, you are considered one of punk rock's greatest accordion players. So what's kind of the anatomy of your background? You're from New Hampshire, correct?
I'm from New Hampshire. Yeah, small town New Hampshire. I will say that the competition for that title may not be, you know,
Well, so
as stringent as some of the other positions.
sure. I mean, and you know, you play guitar, you play banjo, you're a multi-instrumentalist. But it seems like your main wheelhouse is keyboards and accordion. Is that how you started in music? And then when did you get into punk rock? And what kind of made you stay that certain path? Because I know for me, you know, when I was 12 and I got into punk rock, I was like, nothing else matters except electric guitar and power chords now,
Right.
which of course I was very short-sighted and wrong. But you know, speak a little bit to your experience.
Yeah, so I grew up in a very small town in rural New Hampshire, in a sort of cultural isolation. We didn't have, you know, my folks were sort of back to nature artists in the 70s. We didn't have, for many years, running water or plumbing or certainly not television or anything like that. And just, you know, in the pre-internet age, in terms of music fandom and so on, you know, you just didn't have access, even after we came out of that sort of technological isolation. I didn't have access to what was cool other than, you know, Rolling Stone and Spin, essentially, and the one record store in the town about half an hour away. So it wasn't really until I got to college that, and I had a roommate who was from New Jersey and played in punk bands and started taking me to all ages shows at the Wetlands in
Where
New
was
York.
college?
NYU.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So that was sort of like, oh, there's this whole, you know, you start to learn what.
Were you playing music at that point, or did you start playing music in college?
So I was already playing music. I started playing violin when I was 5 or 6, and piano a little after that. French horn in elementary school and junior high band, and I started playing guitar when I was turned 15, as you do, and mandolin and accordion a little after that. And I was going to I was in music school at NYU. I was a music major. I was a classical composition and jazz piano, not with the intention of being either composer or a jazz pianist, but just sort of I figured that was the best way to get the toolkit that I could then go out and do, you know, all kinds of things with.
Mm-hmm.
I just would join bands. I would audition for everything in the Back of the Village Voice. I played all kinds of, like I played guitar in an R&B covers band. I auditioned for, on and on. But eventually I only mentioned my freshman year roommate because I ended up joining this band, World Inferno Friendship Society, which was a punk band with roots in Jersey. So that was a familiar world. And that was the first band that I was in that people really cared about. And so that became the jumping off point for everything else. I guess my point being that since I came to punk rock as more of a late convert, I didn't burn out on it as some people do. I think if they associate it with their teenage years as something that they want to move past. For me, it's something I associate with, you know, my early 20s and a lot of excitement and a scene that I felt a lot of attachment to and a lot of loyalty to and still do, I would say.
Yeah. See, I just flat out never grew up. Like that was like, I just still haven't. Like I still like, yeah, no, that all that stuff's still important. Well, so what were some of the first bands you got into then, coming at it like later in college?
Well, I mean, so I was, I guess it was just like Martin was taking me to these shows. So it'd be like, I don't know, like Mr. T Experience and like, and then it was like, there was ska world was happening then too. So it was like Mephistopheles and the Slackers and things like that. And, you know, I just expanded from there.
Mm-hmm. So
It's never been less. It's never been for me as much about like punk as a style of music. Punk at a certain point became a genre signifier, and for me, especially since my sort of calling card was World Inferno, which is in many ways an unclassifiable band and not a traditional punk band as we were as we were reminded at one point when we were trying to see if I'm about to go on a tangent. Let me finish my first thought, which is that is that for me it was always about the ethos and the people, and that's so for me, we ran this group called Antisocial Music, which was a chamber music collective, composer performer collective. But as far as we were concerned, that was also a punk band. We were putting on shows in the same places that the guitar bands were playing, and so I could easily associate like my love of Moondog and Charles Ives with the same sort of sensibility.
Well, I think in many ways you guys were ahead of your time then, because I mean today, it is sort of more of just this very, very wide umbrella, and it is more an ethos. It is more a state of mind. And because of the internet, I mean, you have access to infinite subgenres, and they're all, it seems like at least, and I'm basing this off of, conversations I've had with the, younger generation coming up now that are 19 and 20 now. It seems like they're all kind of welcome to sort of do their thing. And there's different pockets that appeal to different people, but it's all under the same, still kind of that same touring ethos that, that you and I came up with.
Well, I think that's back to basics, right? Because if you hear people from the 70s talk about it, that's also the refrain, is that it was a state of mind, not a style.
It's true. So in your song, like especially in your track, like This Is Not a Pipe, a lot of things that people will say about you, like a common theme around you, is that this is a dude that has his stuff together and is just a genuinely happy guy that's kind of just doing this lovely creative quilt. And he's just a genuinely happy dude. And even when you're singing about unhappy moments, like in This Is Not a Pipe, that still kind of comes across. Is that an accurate assessment of you?
No, it's entirely inaccurate.
Then I was way off. And
but I'm glad it comes off that way.
So what's coming up next for you then? Is there going to be another book in the future?
Yeah, the second book is written. It's with editors, publishers now. I'm just waiting to see who wants to buy it. Knock on wood.
Dude, can you give anything away, or?
Well, it's fiction. It's a novel. I wrote a novel.
Nice.
So if that goes, that'll be a whole new thing. And if it doesn't, then I'll probably try to pitch another. I've got a couple other nonfiction proposals in various states of completion. But that's sort of in a holding pattern to see if the novel will go.
Well, without giving anything away that you don't want to give away, what made you decide to make the fiction jump?
Seemed like the next, I don't like to repeat myself all that much,
Sure.
And so in the same way that it seemed like after having written, longer and longer essay length stuff, that the next step was to write a book length thing. After having written a book that, didn't set the world on fire, but it got enough traction that it seems like I could do more of that thing. I don't want to do The Humorless Ladies Part 2. And fiction seemed like the next frontier, in terms of a challenge.
Nice, man. And are you touring solo at all coming up? I know I looked on your website. It's mostly like hold steady stuff, but are you going to be doing some solo touring as well, or?
Yeah, not currently. I stopped doing the full-time touring thing not long after my daughter was born, because it was, I could make a pretty good living that way, but it was premised on playing 200 shows a year, and that just wasn't fair to anyone, if nothing else, with little kids at home. So at the moment, I'm sort of splitting my time between these hold steady shows from time to time, the writing stuff. I teach a class at UC Berkeley in reading and writing about music, and I'm going to I'll probably pick up the solo thread again, but with 2 young kids, the bandwidth for more than a couple of creative projects at a time is pretty slim. And I was doing the solo thing really intensely for those 5 years. 4 full lengths, a bunch of other stuff, and it was fine with me to take a break on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you kind of get at that in the book too. Like you kind of, the way you make it clear a chapter, no pun intended, was closing. So was that all very deliberate then?
Was it deliberate? I mean, there's a little bit of an aspect of revising the narrative backwards.
Mm-hmm.
I think if my life hadn't changed, that I would have carried on in that way for as long as I could sustain it. But given that it had, there's a narrative you want to tell yourself, right? And if you can decide that that wasn't that I needed to take a break, then that helps justify it to myself, the having to take a break. That said, the stuff is exhausting, and I had gone through, as I said in the book, getting robbed and getting, ripped off in various ways, and getting, all the expenses and the humiliations and the difficulties of that kind of touring, do start to weigh on you after a while, and you don't want to become the bitter old guy. Of whom I've seen some of those guys on, people 10 or 15 years older than me who I didn't want to be the guy who started snapping at the audience on stage and, walking off. And
oh, you see a lot of that in the comedy world, man. You see a lot of that. I saw a lot of that, like, in my early years and whatnot.
Yeah. So I feel like if you can feel that, I could feel it coming on a little bit. And so to say, maybe I got to just put the pause on for a little bit so I don't become that guy. And, there's a weight that if you love anything, but if you love music particularly, but your living is depending on it, that puts a lot of pressure on it.
Sure.
And I also had some friends who had fulfilling and perfectly lucrative and respectable jobs. And those seemed to be the people who were able to maintain their love of what they were doing, and they could play shows that didn't make them a lot of money, but that they wanted to do, and benefits and stuff like that. And I started looking at them, being like, maybe that's actually a better model if I want to not totally burn out.
So I got to ask you a little favor here as we're closing. One of the New Year's resolutions I had for this show was a couple viewers suggested they want to start doing some book recommendations. So I wanted to turn it over to you because I know you're an incredibly well-read dude. Can you give a couple it can be about whatever you want, just any books, maybe something you read recently, a couple book recommendations for both myself and everybody watching.
Sure. Let me think. I mean, so I've been teaching this class about writing about music, and I think I want to. The parts that worked best were fiction about music. So I've been reading a bunch of fiction about music with the idea of rewriting the syllabus. There's some incredible, fiction writing about music. Let me think. I taught Hari Kunzru's White Tears, which went over really well. There's a Paul Beatty novel called Slumberland about a DJ in Berlin, which is fantastic in that, really intense, jam-packed Paul Beatty kind of style. Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus is one of the most incredible, probably the best novel about Western art music and what it means to be a composer. What else? Willa Cather's Song of the Lark is great on that. Thomas Bernhardt's The Loser is a fantastic one. It's all, if people who are familiar with his style, all of his books are pretty similar. They're long. They're about 200-page rants. So if that sounds appealing. Sam Allingham is this amazing short story writer who lives in Philadelphia, has a book called Great American Songbook that's all short stories that in some way or another are jumping off from music themes. So there's just a couple.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, man. And thank you so much for doing the interview. And again, FranzNicolay.com to learn more about Franz, and check out his book, The Humorous Ladies of Border Patrol. And we look forward to the next book project. And I'm hoping like your website's the best place to keep tabs on that. You'll be announcing it.
Yeah, it sure is.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Franz. I really appreciate it. Is there anything else you want to plug before we sign off?
No, that's it. Thanks, Ron.
Awesome, man. Cheers.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today.